in general, I think, in cyber, some of the problems and how we can kind of rethink how we do things to kind of turn the tables, I suppose. So a bit about myself. I actually run my own company, which has been going 6 years almost to the day, and I've aged about 15 in that period of time. And we specialize in sort of cyber crisis management, resilience, that kind of thing for organizations. But that's kind of boring. I'm also a high altitude climber, which I think is far more interesting. And when I was asked to put this presentation together today, I was asked to talk a little bit about the industry and like how we could change things, maybe bring in some aspects about diversity, why we need to have a more diverse sort of cyber workforce and so on and so forth. And I was thinking about the problem, and I was thinking about how sometimes you have a plan, you have a trajectory, and you need to suddenly change it up, and you need to suddenly come up with new ideas and new solutions to address the problem. And the perfect story for introducing this actually comes from a mistake I made. So this is taken actually this summer in Peru, climbing in the Andes. And this particular mountain was a huge high altitude peak. It's about 6,700 odd meters. It's massive. And this was one of the objectives that myself and my climbing partners wanted to do. And we had a plan. We had looked at the topos, we looked at trip reports, we looked at other climbers who had failed on it that year. What had they done wrong? What happened? What were the problems? And we sort of showed up and we thought pretty cockily, like, you know, we've got this. We're pretty fit. We're pretty strong. We know what we're going to do. So a couple of days in, so you climb for a couple of days, you get to this point here where this photo was taken, which was High Camp, which is about 6,000 meters, so 21,000 feet-ish. And it was beautiful. We got there, we saw this sunset, like the weather was calm, there was no wind, absolutely spectacular views. And you're sort of sitting there and you're thinking, this is just in the bag. This is an easy win now. Like 100% we're getting to the summit, not a problem. And at 6,000 meters, there's about 50% of the partial pressure of oxygen that we're breathing here, which means that when you're lying in your sleeping bag, you're doing a bit of a cardio workout, you're sort of slightly out of breath, which is really lovely sensation. And you get up at midnight for a summit day because you climb basically for 8-9 hours, get to the summit, turn around, come back before it gets dark. So at midnight, the alarm went off and I thought, okay, great. Ice axes, crampons, everything ready. Started off. And it looked really nice. It was really calm, no wind, beautiful. All the weather forecasting that we checked looked perfect. 3 hours into the summit attempt, a storm came in that we hadn't seen anywhere, maybe through negligence, maybe not, who knows. And a storm at 6,000 meters is probably one of the worst things that can possibly happen. And the wind was like nothing I've ever experienced in my life. It got incredibly sketchy very, very, very quickly, and we decided to abandon the summit attempt. Unfortunately, the wind was so horrific, I got some surface level frostbite on my hands, which was very attractive. But we also had to improvise. So a lot of the things that we would do to normally get down the mountain safely, we could no longer do. We had to cut corners, we had to improvise, we had to use things that we'd never otherwise use. We had to abseil off one snow stake at one point, where the person who was abseiling below me was going down, and I could see this snow stake just kind of going... So I stood on it and then realised that meant I now needed to go down on that same snow stake with nobody standing on it. So I went down with my eyes closed. But I'm here, so it was a success. But it made me think that there's actually sometimes the usual way of doing things, you have to just change it up. You have to completely think of a different way of approaching something. And sometimes that can be a bit scary and it's from mistakes or whatever. But I'm hopeful that we can talk a little bit, and I'm hoping that this talk in some ways gives you more questions than it does answers, actually. So what I'm going to look at today is a couple of elements of this. So looking at turning the tables, because at the moment it's very much, in my opinion, skewed towards the attackers. And I think there are a couple of things we can do to try and shift the balance a little bit between our side and their side. More disruption and regulation, which we'll talk about in a moment. Thinking about the problem differently to how we're currently thinking about it. and also looking at the diversity angle as well, and the humans being the focal point of everything. So I'm obviously a climber, and one of the key sort of parts of training for climbing is your anaerobic capacity, so how you can exercise, that cardio kind of exercise. So I was watching this video on aerobic training, and there were two guys, one was interviewing the other. And the interviewer, the guy that was being interviewed said to the interviewer, "Why do you breathe?" And he said, to everyone watching this video, just pause the video here and answer the question, "Why do you breathe?" And I thought, I know that. Take in oxygen, pass out carbon dioxide. Simple. Done. The interviewer gave very similar response. And then the guy said, "Okay, cool, but why? Why do you take in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide?" So I paused the video again, and I was like, I don't know, carbon dioxide's a waste product, so you have to get rid of it, and like, oxygen you take in for like energy and stuff, maybe, I don't know, something like that. And I was kind of aware that my answer was now really starting to stretch the limits of my knowledge of biology. And the interviewer gave a very similar response, and then he said again, "Okay, so how do you get energy from oxygen?" And I was like, I don't know. I don't know why we breathe. I have no idea why we breathe. Turns out I don't have a clue. But it was a really interesting way of thinking of things. And what I liked about it was when you ask the question why several times, very quickly you appreciate that your understanding of the thing that you thought you really, really, really understood, actually you don't really, really understand it. And I thought quite cockily, well, of course I know why we breathe. Yeah, I don't. I didn't know why we breathe at all. No clue. I do now, but back then definitely did not know. And I think that's very true in cyber as well, because I think there's a lot of times when we talk about things that we have a surface level of knowledge about, which I think is good, and I think we all need that. But if you start to drill down into the why, you quickly realize this isn't my area of expertise. This is someone else's area of expertise. And perhaps we ought to turn to those people. So I think the lesson really that I took from this was that if I have a question asked to me about, for example, pen testing, I don't know really anywhere near a sufficient amount of information about pen testing. So I'm going to go to one of my friends who is a pen tester and get them to answer the question. And I think staying in your lane and understanding what you understand and passing on to somebody else what you don't is really, really crucial for collaboration. And so speaking of disruption, this is, for those of you who don't know, this was the beginning of Medusa, who are a ransomware group. They did a promo video, which if you haven't watched it, go and watch it because it's absolutely awful. The production quality just isn't there for a group that earns that much money. But anyway, so ransomware is kind of my thing. And I talk an awful lot about ransomware. And I think the one thing we have as an issue in the industry when it comes to ransomware is fundamentally we are making a really big mistake with how we talk about it, how we discuss solutions to it, how we talk about it as a sort of global issue, as a micro issue. And that's because I think for a lot of people, we're living in a little bit of an idealistic scenario. And what I mean by that is, when I've done a lot of work in this space, one of the things that I come across a lot are two sort of myths that get pushed out by the cybersecurity community when it comes to ransomware. And both of them are incorrect, and both of them don't help us solve the actual problem that we're seeing. So the first one is, if you pay, they won't be true to their word. Now, I would love that to be true. I would really love that to be true because it would be a great stick to say, do not pay a ransom. No one wants anyone to pay a ransom. But the truth is that there is not an awful lot of evidence to back that up. Because actually what we're seeing is ransomware groups build brands. Those brands are completely contingent upon being true to their word. And if they say they have your data and if you don't pay them, they're going to dump it online. And then you pay them and they still dump it online, the next person is not going to pay them. And they understand that. And the insurance companies understand that. And the ecosystem that has built up around ransomware understands that. And so as a result, they often are true to their word, which doesn't really help our moral argument of don't pay the ransom, but that's the reality. The second sort of myth that I see proliferated a lot is that if you pay the ransom, you'll be hit again. Again, very little evidence to support that at all in the wild. And actually, / hilariously, all of the clients I've worked with who have paid a ransom have actually got their general counsels to draft terms and condition agreements with the ransomware groups that say, you promise not to hit us for 2 years, which they sign. So that's the reality of the situation. And the reason I say this, and it is awkward, it's a difficult topic to talk about because no one wants to advocate for paying a ransom. I'm not advocating for paying a ransom. But in order to fix the problem of ransomware and to start thinking about how we're going to innovate and change how this balance of power is operating, we need to actually look at the reality of the situation and address the reality, not address the idealistic situation that we want to be in, that we hoped we would be in. And I think that the real areas here where we need to start sort of innovating and discussing, mainly around cryptocurrency. So when I talk about how people talk about how we're going to disrupt ransomware, because at the moment ransomware groups are a bit running amok. They're all over the place. They're making tons of money, and they're able to wash that money very, very quickly. So the problem from a crypto perspective is that there's many problems from a crypto perspective, but this particular problem, there's a great piece from Pablo Escobar's accountant, and he talks about in his book how the major problem they had for the Medellin cartel was that they had all this money and they couldn't clean it. They couldn't wash it through and put it into bank accounts and actually use it. So what they would do is put them in farms, put it in floorboards, put it in all these different locations and hide all this cash. And they lost billions every single year to rats. Rats were literally eating billions from this cartel. And what's kind of cool, I suppose, in a sort of dystopian way, is that now we live in a world where you could have washed that through various different cryptocurrency blockchains pretty much undetected, and you don't have that issue. So if we look at the disruption that we've actually managed to cause in terms of tracing the money, the only case that ever really gets cited is Colonial Pipeline. So DarkSide, who were the ransomware group involved in that attack, I think probably if they were ever interviewed would say it was a mistake to have hit Colonial Pipeline. They hit Colonial Pipeline. Colonial Pipeline paid the ransom. But the attack was so significant and so noisy that the FBI got stuck in. And they managed to recover a small percentage of the cryptocurrency, but not lots. And overall, that's pretty much the only case we ever really cite as an example of how we disrupted the flow of money. So a lot of these problems revolve around kind of coming out of thinking, well, just don't pay the ransom. No one should pay the ransom. Of course, that's the idealistic situation we would love to get to. But the reality is people pay the ransom. I saw a study that said 86% of companies pay the ransom. Boeing got hit last week, I think, and I'm not going to say they did pay the ransom. All I'm saying is Lockbit took them off the website. You can draw your own conclusions as to what happened there. But people pay. And in order for us to start thinking about how we disrupt ransomware and how we actually change this balance, we have to acknowledge that people are paying. And we have to deal with that problem, not say, well, you should never pay. Which comes on to the next topic of problematic activity that I've been looking into really recently, which is disrupting hacktivism. So hacktivism, and I'm talking specifically about hacktivism in the context of armed conflict. So I'm not talking about animal rights activists, people like that. I'm talking about hacktivism that stems from armed conflict that's going on in the world. So the ICRC, you may have already seen this, put out 8 rules that they sort of said were sort of rules of engagement, I suppose, for hacktivists that they suggested, some of which were don't hit civilian targets, don't hit hospitals, you know, the things that you typically expect under international humanitarian law. And it was a good first start. It was definitely a good first start. The problem that we've been seeing is It all started, obviously, predominantly with the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And that sort of birthed, I suppose, an issue with one group in particular, known as Killnet, who also have videos. You can go off and watch promo videos. And Killnet and Anonymous Sudan are obviously pro-Russian hacktivist groups, incredibly well-resourced, incredibly sophisticated, very good at what they do, and have caused a lot of problems. But I think what's more interesting, in a sense, was the situation that has happened really recently with Israel and Palestine. So on the Saturday, when the attack happened, the first attack happened, shall I say, an Indonesian hacktivist group and the Moroccan cyber army, who are unsurprisingly based in Morocco, went and attacked and took offline Israeli news sources, so newspapers, etc., that were online. DDoSed them, took them offline. In response to that, the Indian cyber force, then hit Palestinian businesses, took a load of Palestinian businesses offline. This is all basically within 24 hours of that first attack. That then caused Anonymous Ghost, who are a Palestinian group, to attack the Indian government and several key businesses in India. And then we saw the same Palestinian group exploit a vulnerability in the Red Alert app, which is the Israeli sort of missile alert system. And they sent fake notifications to Israeli citizens saying there was a nuclear bomb that had been sent out. So then Iran gets involved. Well, Iran's hacktivists, shall I say, get involved. Cyber Avengers went after the Dorad power station in Israel. And then the anti-Iranian group, the Arvin Club, went after things in Iran. And very quickly, within probably 5 days, you had a bunch of countries brought into a conflict that otherwise really wouldn't have been involved in that conflict. You know, India wasn't going to typically be brought in 24 hours after that attack was launched. But yet, hacktivists did that. Hacktivists brought everybody involved. And for the first time ever, we are seeing sort of civilians, if you like, being able to get involved in armed conflict and influence government decisions, influence government thought processes. Which is the first time in history, because usually you would need to have weapons and you would need training and you would need people on the ground. And now we have hacktivists that can basically do all of this themselves. So again, we have to start thinking outside the box. And one of the points I wanted to make about this was when the ICRC brought out their rules of engagement, a lot of people in the community mocked it. And they laughed and they made fun of it. And I think they missed the point, actually. Because I think the point of those rules was not really to bring order to all of these groups that are kind of anarchistic within their nature. I think the point of those rules was to start a discussion as to how we can start regulating this conduct, which at the moment is, quite frankly, chaos. And it's causing damages to businesses, it's causing damage to governments. It has the risk of escalating armed conflict as well around the world. So I think, again, when we're seeing people make attempts to start thinking outside the box, start bringing in new ideas, I think it's really important that instead of just shooting them down, we actually start looking at how we could start a discussion from them and develop them further. Funnily enough, Killnet did say that they would abide by those rules. I don't know how much you want to trust that, but that's what they said. So another issue that obviously always comes out with this, with regards to cyber, is diversity, the talents and skill shortage, and burnout. And I think I always really struggle talking about diversity because I'm acutely aware that I'm a white woman from a pretty privileged background, and I'm not really the most suitable person to start talking about diversity. But I do think that when we view risk, the way we view risk and the way we manage risk is often built upon our personal experiences and what we know from our experiences in life. What have we seen before? What are the patterns that we've seen before? And what did that lead to? And if we all have very similar backgrounds, we're all going to view risk in a very similar way, which is going to leave us much more vulnerable to attack, to not seeing opportunity, to not seeing other things like that. And that kind of comes into burnout as well. So one of the things that someone mentioned to me the other day was about the rate of burnout in Europe in the cybersecurity industry was some ridiculously high figure. And I was thinking about it, and I was thinking there's this culture online amongst us all, which is very much about how you have to be working 7 days a week. And somehow you're not really committed if you're taking a holiday. And you're not really committed if you're saying, well, I'm going to just take the week off and enjoy time with my family. And somehow, like, you need to be online, you need to be on LinkedIn, you need to be posting, you need to be doing this course and going to that event. And all of it actually isn't at all healthy. And it's not really helping us get to a point where we can start seeing the problem, seeing the wood through the trees, so to speak, and actually starting to deal with it in creative ways, because we're all literally maxed out and our bandwidth is completely taken up by everything else. So I think, again, in terms of attitudes as a community, it's really important to recognize that there's absolutely nothing wrong with someone taking a break. There's absolutely nothing wrong with taking time out from work or taking a break between jobs. That's completely fine. And everyone can just, do what's best for them. Which brings me to my final piece. And this is something that has come to my attention really recently, sort of within the last year. And it kind of links back to the ransomware group issue. And the issue that we have in cybersecurity is something that I think is best called cyber inequality. And that happens at two levels. So the first level that I would say needs to be sort of thought about, which relates to ransomware, is that we've seen a huge spike in ransomware groups going after companies in Latin America in particular, but also South Africa and countries like this. And the reason they're doing that is twofold. Firstly, it means that they can attack organizations in those countries and probably not attract the attention of Europol and the FBI, who probably aren't going to care. The second benefit, I suppose, for them is that they get to try out new tactics and techniques without necessarily being picked up and looked at. And they also can harvest a load of money from these companies as well. And the problem that we have is that these countries in sort of South America, for example, don't necessarily have the same level of expertise in their law enforcement. They haven't got the same sort of maturity as they're going through a rapid digitalization process at the moment, all of which leaves them hugely vulnerable. But it also means that they can become safe harbors for a lot of these criminals as well, because their law enforcement doesn't necessarily have the sort of expertise that some of the other countries have who have dealt with it much, much longer. The other side to the cyber inequality piece, which I think is concerning within our and hampering a lot of our progress as an industry, is at a national level. And I was made aware of this at an event where I spoke to the CISO of a large bank, and he said that his cyber team was 3,000 people. And I thought, wow, what are they doing? And then I spoke to one of my friends, Jake Moore, and he was talking about farms. And he was saying that farms have a huge amount of sort of digitalization now in terms of to increase efficiency and productivity and things like that. But they're not going to have a CISO. They're not going to have a security team. They're not going to probably have anyone providing support for the most part for anything that they're doing. Yet, in many ways, they're critical national infrastructure. If you were, for example, a hacktivist group and you wanted to cause wide-scale disruption, you'd have sort of some really weak areas in the UK, just to name one country, where you could hit them and cause maximum disruption with very, very little support for those industries. And I think one of the problems, we always talk about the skills gap. What we're not talking about is how the complete lack of talent, complete lack of people who are going into industries lower down, because there's a group of financial institutions who can afford to pay large six-figure salaries. They can afford to pay for all these people and have 3,000 cybersecurity people on their team. But that leaves a massive void for a lot of other companies who now don't have any ability to do that. So how do we start managing that as well as a community? Because that's obviously giving us some really big weak points that I think we need to address. So I hope this has been a super depressing start to your day. Go and check out the ransomware group videos if you want to laugh, because they are funny. Funny in a kind of funny, not funny kind of way. If you want unhackable goat stickers, I am around all day. Come and see me. Someone go and volunteer for the talk. Otherwise, I think I have the right to select them. Do I not? Didn't we agree that? And if you have any questions, I'm wandering around. Come find me. Enjoy your day, guys.